Okay, thank you, Dewey. That was a rich start to the conversation. I want to go back. You mentioned 2015 a couple different times. So can you just unpack what it is that happened in 2015 that shifted um, some of the landscape?
Yes, yeah, and I'll try to be as concise as possible. But to start, I actually have to go to 1968. In the 1968 Fair Housing Act, there's a part called "Affirmatively Further Fair Housing." It's been in the news a lot, but it's actually written in the Fair Housing Act. And pretty much, and I'm not an attorney, but generally what it says is that the local jurisdictions have an obligation to further fair housing. So instead of just being compliant, you actually have to go, do something more. But there was nothing ever defined about what that means at all, really. There were a couple of changes throughout the 90s. But in 2015, one of the things that happened with housing is that HUD defined what AFFH means. It means that they defined it specifically that you have to go out of your way to meet certain obligations, and they had certain criteria for what local jurisdictions had to do. So what that means is counties, cities that accept federal money have to pass a certain litmus test for how they are addressing housing segregation. So not just proving that the future zoning is not going to be segregated, but they have to do something to address existing segregation. The reason why that's necessary is because it hasn't been done, as we talked about, since like this 1968. So in 2015, that was defined. And a lot of progress started happening, especially in major cities that took it seriously and started like producing reports. So that's pretty much what happened in 2015. And then in 2020, you might know, that's getting heavily challenged.
Yeah, so I know a little bit about this, not a lot, not about the 2015 thing, but the AFFH, because we've been working heavily with the city of Mesquite on their CDBG consolidated plan. So we're adopting a new consolidated plan for 2020 through 2024. And we have a great CDBG coordinator here in North Texas. I mean, in Mesquite, Community Development Block Grant. So this is a federal grant that comes. I should probably let Dewey define this, but it's a federal grant that comes to cities or municipalities to address housing disparities, to do community development work. But it's 60% or 65% of the monies have to be directed towards housing. So 15% can be directed to social services, 20% overhead, but 65% of it has to go to housing. It cannot be new housing. It has to be housing redevelopment. And so every 4 years, the agencies, municipalities, cities to whom these block grants are given have to develop a 4-year plan. And in that, they have to identify impediments to housing, and they have to identify how they are going to address those impediments to fair housing. And so we went through this whole process. I mean, we didn't, but the city has gone through this whole process. And part of that is our own input from the community. And many of you here in the St. Stephen community participated in that survey to identify the priorities that we want in our CDBG grant. And this is not an insignificant amount of money. It's nearly 1.4 million, I think, for us in Mesquite a year. So we're talking about, $6 million over the course of 4 years. I mean, it's not going to change the world, but it's not chump change. And so anyway, I'm interested, since then, you mentioned a lot of work or progress after 2015 for cities that took it seriously. And of course, this came under HUD. Now we
Right.
know that 2015 was in the previous administration. So I'm wondering, what has the current HUD administration done, or are they doing to help fair housing or to dismantle segregation or racism?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm so well. Before I don't answer that question,
He's like, I can't answer that question.
yeah. I want to say mobilizing people to participate in the AI and consolidated plan. Like my reaction was big because like that doesn't happen. Like in the 60s, we saw a huge movement and housing was really big on it. And I've seen a lot more since the pandemic hit. But what you did or what your community did like is really rare. And so like if it helps push the needle in an organized way, like that's exactly what's needed. And that's what's missing right now. I don't see that in my current
number?
Mm-hmm. Numbers are good.
In 2016, for our 2016 consolidated plan, they had 22 residents participate in the residential input survey.
Right.
This year, we had 150.
Whoa! Oh my gosh!
And
oh my gosh! Yeah.
Here's the other thing. I mean, this is Ruby Butler, who's our CDBG coordinator. Ruby Butler took her team out into the field, into neighborhoods that were identified in the previous consolidated plan as CDBG neighborhoods, redevelopment neighborhoods that were identified as, with housing impediments, and did door-to-door surveys of residents in those neighborhoods for another 180 surveys. So we had 300 surveys total from residents this time round.
That's wild.
That is a 1,500% increase.
Yeah, that is so impressive to hear. So I mean, that CDBG coordinator, I really wish was HUD secretary.
Okay, I'm here. Ruby.
Hey, I'm a private nonprofit. So I'm not government. As far as what your administration or what the current administration does to answer your question, no, it's actively attacking the Fair Housing Act in ruthless ways. I mean, we talked a little about AFFH, and that is getting rolled back. Another thing getting rolled back is even being able to prove what I mentioned earlier, something called disparate impact, which is the process of proving that people of color are disproportionately affected by something. So even if there's like one like white person affected by a negative housing practice, HUD is rolling back the ability to prove that it's racist. They did so. I mean, disparate impact is used in a few different things like Voting Rights Act and stuff like that. But HUD is saying that there are 30 new obstacles that people have to prove to be able to bring a case using that type of argument of disparate impact. And it's just giving landlords a bunch of outs. So if there is, unless it's literally redlined, unless a housing provider says, I'm not renting to you because of the color of your skin or something like that, even then, I've heard clients saying that their landlord said it. It has to be in writing, unless the landlord hands the tenant like a letter saying that they're being discriminated against because of the current administration. I can't bring stuff to HUD complaints. Attorneys are telling me to not bring stuff to HUD complaints that are racial discrimination, like criminal background checks. There are certain guidelines that housing providers aren't supposed to keep, felonies over a certain amount of years, and they're not supposed to just have too broad of criminal background restrictions. But I see it all the time. If anybody viewing has seen it, email me, because we do discrimination testing. But even then, I have to drop those cases. I can't do anything as an advocate. The attorneys are saying last year I could, and this year I can't.
Wow. Not quite sure what to do with that. Except to say to our listening audience, exercise your, not your right, your duty to vote.
Civic duty.
Exercise your civic duty to vote this November. become active in the conversation. Because the things that we're describing here, this is not 1964, okay? This is 2020. In 1964, my parents managed an apartment building in Wichita, Kansas, for an absentee landlord who told them they were not to rent to Black people. And when a Black couple came to their door with the for rent sign from an available apartment, they called the landlord and said, "We're renting to them tomorrow. If you want to stop it, you can come down here and do it." But this isn't 1964. This is 2020. And this kind of thing is still happening. You just heard from Dewey. And it's happening out in the open. I mean, no one's...
Bolder and bolder.
Yeah, no one's being sly about this.
It's not covert.
It's not covert.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we want to all believe that these things are in the past. But as Dewey's already talked about, there are legacies out there that John mentioned fracking and just in a one-line comment. And I think of the technique of packing and cracking. Once you start moving people into certain areas and other areas, as Dewey pointed out, start accumulating wealth and accumulating equity and passing that down, others don't, that creates systemic racism. Okay? So we're not saying, again, that, you know, half the people are walking around with racist on their forehead, but this is in the system. It's in the water like the fluoride. And we have to get it out. We have to expose it and we have to get it out. When I moved from 75205 to 75150, my insurance company that I've been with for 20 years called me and said, "Your automobile insurance is increasing." And I said, "Now, why would that be? I haven't had an accident. You know, my record's clean, no tickets, nothing." They said, "Oh, because your zip code." I said, "My zip code has nothing to do with my driving habits. I'm the very same driver they've been insuring for 20 years. But they increased my insurance because I now live in a zip code that isn't like the zip code I used to live in. It's not predominantly white." The irony of this is when I was living in 205 for the last 2 years, I was driving on Central Expressway and 635 every day to get back and forth from University Park to Mesquite. Now that's more dangerous than the 2-minute trip I now take from my house to the church on street roads. So my risk has actually gone down, but my cost has gone up because of a type of redlining, because someone identified an area by statistics and said, we have to treat these people differently. Now, I'm not saying, right, but this kind of stuff is going on. Am I off base on this?
Yeah, no, and one of the things that really plays into that is money. Like anytime there's money involved, it's because it's about, you know, what's most economically efficient. So the insurance company thinks that they're going to lose more money from you because there's a higher risk, they think, because of the zip code, in the same way that, like, you know, there has to be one big developer to develop a neighborhood of color before more money comes in. That one big developer, you know, does that in a way that also negatively affects the residents that live there, because we see this all the time, the money and the way it circulates, you know. The way to answer that issue is not to develop the neighborhood in a way that generates money for investors that don't live in the neighborhood. That's not that's not how to do it. I don't know exactly how to do it, but I know that's not how to do it.
Mm.
I wonder, Dewey, if you can offer some some maybe simpler steps that our folks might be able to take We know voting is one of them. We know participating in these types of surveys. We were talking about before. What are other things that they can do to help work toward better housing equity?
That's a good question. Okay, so first, the fact that y'all already mobilized for the consolidated plan or AI is amazing. A lot of the housing inequalities and inequities happen on the local level just like that. So continuing that work when it's time to look at residential zoning, which depending on the city council and the jurisdiction happens in different ways through committees or, like annually or whatever. But bidding for more affordable housing is really necessary, and it's something that landlords or even a lot of the time community members will organize against on a local level. That I've seen in North Texas. Exactly. Yeah. The NIMBY, the not in my backyard. Yeah. I mean, I've seen that in 2018, like people just yelling at a city council for having more affordable housing in a certain area. So it's stuff like that more affordable housing is really important for zoning, and stuff like this of what you're currently doing with education is really good too. And then also, I would highly recommend reading The Accommodation. You email me after, and we can get you a copy.
Okay, so let's unpack zoning a little bit, because isn't that just to keep residents and commercial away from each other? So we have.
It's to keep white residents and commercial away from each other.
No, wait.
Yeah.
No, wait a minute. Hold on a second. Let's unpack this a little.
Sorry.
So walk me through how this works. Yeah, if you can.
Okay. Yeah. No problem. It always starts with an outside group that wants to build something, whether it be like a plant, which is industry, or an apartment complex, which would be residential. But an outside company wants to build something. In order to build something, as you might know, to like form construction and get certain permits, they have to be approved by some level of government. I mean, this depends, but typically it's like some type of committee. It usually is voted on in a final vote on council about who's allowed to build where. Now, the reason why I said that zoning is supposed to keep white residents out of commercial areas is because it does that. If we look at the map, Dallas is still heavily racially segregated, and we can see white neighborhoods and they're not near industrial neighborhoods. There is some overlap in zoning that allows for some discrepancies of dual use of agricultural/residential or industrial/agricultural. In those zones, looking at maps, we see are in black and brown neighborhoods. And so that's why we have issues like Shingle Mountain in Dallas that is in a residential area. You may know is like a 6-story, 100-ton mountain of shingles. The organizers that are protesting that frequently cite the Blue Ribbon Committee, which is the committee that was used to address zoning in the 1950s after the Klan bombings. Like this is a continuation. It's the same discussion and it's at the same place. So yeah, that type of zoning, like we find patterns of discrimination in all types of zoning.
So we have to pay attention to zoning across the board.
Yes.
Not just the rezoning that's happening down the block from my own house.
Yes, exactly. Because if it's racially segregated and you live in a white neighborhood, you won't see it. That's the nature of it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts. We in Mesquite right now have a moratorium on multi-use, not multi-use, multi-family building. There's a moratorium on apartment building. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that. Sorry, I'm sort of springing that on you, but.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know any specifics, but a moratorium on like constructing new multifamily units.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, and this is specific. Some housing experts say that single resident occupancy is actually like a good idea to address housing inequality. It really just depends. in my practice, or in my, my work, I see a lot of families that are like needing much more housing. And so that's strange to me, because I think that it could more effectively be used about what type of multifamily housing is zoned, right? I mean, there are different types, as you know, of subsidized buildings that not just housing vouchers like what we talked about, but the state also can have a low income tax credit, housing that really does provide. And so I think that there are probably better ways to address a housing crisis than to put a moratorium on building new housing. I understand we need to be intentional for a lot of historical reasons, but I don't know much about it. I don't think that would be a good solution.
Well, it's not that we don't want to build new housing. What we want to build is a certain kind of housing.
Right.
And we want to build a certain kind of housing that will allow our existing residents to move up from starter homes to, the next, and therefore raise the tax base and raise the property values and et cetera, et cetera. And what multifamily housing does is attract crime and overload our school system.
Yeah. So we see evidence that that's not true, and I want to talk about that. Okay. So yeah, thank you. I misunderstood the question. Actually, I thought the question was like how to address housing insecurity. So when I talk about single resident occupancies, I'm not talking about what you're describing. I'm talking about stuff to address people that aren't housed. What you're describing, you're exactly right. And the stereotypes of like more crime, less education aren't true. We see more incarceration in areas that like are zoned for particularly low income tax credit housing sometimes. Even that has gone away, and I'll get into that. But that's not because of more crime. Studies have shown over and over, and that's coming from like Michelle Alexander's book from National Fair Housing Alliance, that it's not that different type of people commit more crime. It's that they are arrested more for the same levels of crime. And so the solution then is, now we have a bunch of poor people. Now we have to police them. And then, now we see arrests increase. And it seems that's a cycle. That's very cyclical. Nowadays, even that's not true. Like the housing projects that we have now come from the state. It's not housing vouchers, but the state can construct buildings and just have individual properties have income restrictions and applications. Those are luxury apartments. The good thing about the system is that they are really, really nice. The bad thing is that they're nice because they have to win out on such an intense bidding system that it's really hard to win a bidding system to be able to get a bid like that. And so because there are so few, they're really nice, but there are not enough of them. One of the reasons that there aren't enough of them is in order to place a bid, if a developer wants to place a bid to the state, even before like the construction process early on, they have to get the local government on board and have a vote just to approve a bid to have a low income or mixed income tax credit property built. So it's all the same system.
One of the other things that we've seen happen, not in the current, one of the things that we saw happen in the previous consolidated plan, CDBG consolidated plan, is that, so I mean, you can speak to this more technically, but there are different rungs or ranges of income impaired or housing impaired. So like below 50% AMI is a very low income, 50 to 80 is low income. Am I getting this right?
Right, yeah.
And then 80 to 100 or 80 to 120 or something.
Yeah, it just depends on who's rating it, actually, to be honest with you.
Okay. So one of the things that we've seen is that monies that are intended to address housing disparity, impediments to housing, fair housing, etc., are targeted to that 80 to 100% band of people rather than the 50 to 0% band. So we can still say we're addressing fair housing or we're helping the poor, but we're helping the, just that top little tier. The ones that I guess
It's probably the least expensive.
Well, they're
to
the
address.
least expensive to help. They're the most expensive to sort of pull out of poverty and hope that they'll then, to quote, reference another episode, to bootstrap themselves the rest of the way up. Never mind if that's a myth. Whereas, if we're going to go down to help the 50% and below band, the very low income, then that's going to take a lot of work.
Yeah, it's gonna, and there's supposed to be structures in place that can do that like overnight. If $1 trillion went into the housing authorities across the country, realistically, we're not even in a place where that would happen. Like the IRS is like more efficient than the local housing authority. Seriously.
Well,
That's not good.
Yeah, yeah, it's a nightmare. Yeah.
I'm concerned about that. Okay, well, we've had a lot to think about. We've covered a lot of territory. Are there any other closing thoughts that you'd like to lift up to us? Things that we can be looking at and teaching, educating ourselves about?
Yeah. I've said a lot, so nothing that I haven't already said. Thanks you all for having me. If there is one thing, it's just to, I've already given a bunch of sources, information and stuff, but I want to context again how like important and unique it is to be organizing around housing issues, like on a local level. Like that is really, really, really big. That's not small. That is a really big deal. And so I think that, y'all should know that.
Well, I appreciate that. We would not be doing what we do, and we would not be as effective as we are if it weren't for our partners at Faith in Texas. And I especially want to give a shout out to Joe Swanson, who is our organizer. And
We love Joe.
Yeah, we love Joe. Joe works very hard to both educate us and to take our concerns back to the group and to connect us with resources like yourself, and to arm us with the information that we need to go out there and carry the standard and demand justice, or at least more justice. So we're grateful. We're in this together. We're not alone. But it is a long and complicated system that is deeply ingrained in our culture and in our land. This is literally a kind of racism that has taken roots in the land itself. And that's going to take a long time to overcome. So we just got to keep working and working and working.
Don't take our foot off the gas.
So we appreciate you being with us today, Dewey, and we appreciate your partnership and work behind the scenes in all that you're doing to fight for fair housing, advocate for fair housing here in North Texas.
Appreciate it. Thank you, y'all. Like us on Facebook, like us on Twitter. Appreciate it, y'all. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave.
Yeah.